how are people terraforming alerts, specifically in the case where there are many identical underlying resources spread across numerous accounts or environments that require different threshold values? So to articulate a bit more, imagine you have 20 EKS clusters and you want to monitor something like host.io that is going to vary environment to environment that you can't just set defaults for. How are you handling that in this case? My approach is as follows, but I'd love to learn something better or other alternatives. Have a directory with YAML files, each containing a single alert. In each alert file, have some non-environment specific values like a query, which will always be the same cluster to cluster. Have an options section, which basically, or unfortunately, contains all the environmental specification, mainly like the threshold values for every environment. Loop through all those values and all the files using a Terraform file set, YAML encode every file and put the file of the alert in a local TF object. Add the non-environment specific options to a list, get all the environment specific stuff. I think, I guess the gist of it is you're doing parameterization or templating of YAML alerts in order to do this. So yeah, so let's see, someone else, Oscar, says, looks sane to me. Anything specific that bugs you here? So yeah, I guess what would be your ideal way of doing this, Jonas? Or what is the specific rub?
I mean, I came up against this trying to use the Cloud Posse Datadog monitor module, and in this case, surprisingly, isn't handled there. And so, the reason that I asked the question is because I just wanted to have some, let's see, what's the word? Prudence, I guess. Anytime that I find myself writing, or on the precipice of writing like potentially hundreds of similar resources, obviously I want to stop and say, wait a second, is this about to become a huge waste of time? I can't really see any other way to do it because, like I said, the values do need to differ. So, it got me wondering. I don't know. It just basically, I spoke to, another DevOps engineer on my team, and he was kind of like, yeah, orchestrated alerting is sort of tough in that regard if you actually want to do it with any type of, surgical precision. And also, it just struck me as a good kind of, I don't know what use case / question for office hours. So I figured I'd comment if anybody had any brilliant.
So yeah, I'm going to be biased, of course, and say, I was kind of one of the architects behind this module, and I'm not going to dispute necessarily what you say at all. I'll just spin kind of how we were thinking about it and contrasting that to some of the other Datadog modules that I've seen out there. For example, it doesn't have to be Datadog, any other system. So if we look at many of the Datadog modules, they will create like a module per alert and then parameterize it, which I found was just very tedious to define that much boilerplate for everything you wanted to monitor. But
are you talking about a Terraform module?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm with you. Okay.
And I forget the company. What's interesting is I could see that module was based off of the Cloud Posse one in the early days, but we gutted it and we redid the whole thing. And my problem with that was that there's just so much that you can end up wanting to parameterize that, like, this is parameterizable, all of these things are, and it's like, where do you draw that line? So in trying to create a reusable module across organizations, I was like, not going to happen. So the approach that I'm taking now instead is this is a declarative configuration in itself. The query is the thing that mostly varies. Why don't we just copy the set of monitors for each environment and customize the actual query without having, like, this is not hard to parameterize and change the values here. So that's kind of like the approach we've taken, is to create, we don't do it per account environment. We right now we're getting away with mostly prod and non-prod, but
right.
Everyone's mileage may vary. And obviously, the more granular you want to go, the more tedious it is to keep those in sync, maybe across environments.
So then, yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of six in one hand, half dozen in the other, because I think what I hear you saying is, if I had a bunch of, like, I think what I hear you saying is, let's say I, had a situation where I needed to monitor for something that was for identical resources in different environments with differing values, you would just make a YAML file for every alert for every environment. So you would have one called like dev host latency, and you'd have your values in there. And then you'd have another called QA host latency, and you'd have your values in there. Is that right? Is that what you?
That's the gist of what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
Yeah, or saying.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I guess in the end, now that I think about it, that's basically, I've just done it all in one file. I don't know. I guess when I was writing when I was like mocking up the YAML, an example of which I posted in the office hours chat, I was just like, you know how it is when you're like neck deep in something, you're like, yeah, that makes more sense. But actually, in retrospect, now that I hear what you're saying about just having different files, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
That would be I mainly wanted to ask this, like, does anybody have like some like brilliant observation about, oh no, this is how you can like get out of having to do that 5,000 times? Because I don't really see a way myself, like how to get out of, like, if you have, it's identical resources with differing values that where I'm really rocked. Like there's in the case where it's like, yeah, I can basically have this be the same across everything. Obviously, yeah, that's trivial. You know what I mean? It's the same resources with differing values. That's where I'm like kind of up against the wall.
So you can look at this. This was the one I was thinking of. It's by Clarinet. It's called Terraform Datadog Monitors. And this was the approach we started with. And that's when I said, like, this is why we didn't invest in it. I didn't like it at all. Like, you have to have a module for every single situation that you want to monitor, and all the boilerplate that goes along with it. I guess it's nice because you can document that one monitor. It's just very, very expensive to create a new thing you want to monitor. That's why I love this YAML approach. It's so lightweight. You get 80% of the value for 20% of the effort.
Right. No, I like the YAML approach too, for sure. I'm going to keep going in that. Yeah, exactly. That seems like too much effort. So I guess they handle that where they just have a bunch of different TFRs files then effectively.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's in the end how you invoke it. And that's the other thing. It's like, what are you going to be calling all these variables? And you just have a variable explosion. It's like parameterizing to parameterize at that point.
Okay.
So someone else had something they were going to add.
Oh yeah. I was just going to say, one of the things that I've done to sort of try and pare down the explosion of parameters is it's possible in a lot of cases to use APM to establish like a baseline for a particular parameter across a bunch of different components. And I started out by using this in the most basic case, which was just, I've got thousands of logs coming in from different directions, and each of them has its own kind of periodicity. So I wanted to create a baseline for each component that told me when I was in an anomaly. And most often that just gave me a really basic sort of detection for, for when logs were offline and they shouldn't be, like, a particular ingestion.
Right. So I think the question here is more about like, okay, so he has that, he knows how they vary.
Yeah, I have the statistics. I have the statistics. Now I need to actually alert on them, and they're all differing.
So that was kind of where I started with that, was, just using APM just to establish the baseline. But as I started to explore it a little bit further, I realized that there are particular areas, not every area, but there are other areas where you can establish other kind of baselines on top of your baseline. Like, for instance, if you've got logs that are coming in that have a particular, select insert ratio or something like that, which turns out to be a big indicator of a particular type of problem that I happen to have a lot.
Yeah.
So you can build that on top of the ingestion and say, okay, well, that ratio may be different across a bunch of different databases, but when it changes, it actually is something that's
So you want to look at like the derivatives of the metrics, or like, the ratios in this case, or the rate at which, in other words, the rate of which things are a problem. And those rates should be problems in multiple environments. So maybe there's another dimension to look at, Jonas.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, yeah. I'll ping you, Mark, because I think you're like a step ahead of me in that, everything I'm interested in right now is primitive in the sense that it's like, even though they've been generated somewhat dynamically by looking at, statistics over time, they're fairly static in that I'm basically just guessing. But, what you're getting at there about this, like, actually effective observability, like something like Charity Majors would talk about like not just monitoring a bunch of BS, but stuff that actually indicates a real problem. It seems like you have pretty good experience there. And that's definitely already on my mind, even as I'm building out this monitoring module. I'm like, you know what? This is only going to be mediocre at best. Like, I'm going to deploy all these alerts and it's going to be better than nothing, significantly better. But in the end,
Yeah.
I'm gonna like end up figuring out, and I'm also really starting to look at synthetics because of that. Like, it almost seems like that's more the area that is going to be more important. But anyway, I'll thanks for the feedback, and I'll ping you to chat about that more. It sounds like you have solid experience there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to work on something with you. Like,
cool, man.
Collaboration is cool.
Cool.
Let's see here. We had some. Sorry, go on, Andrew.
It may not be relevant to your particular situation, but my big epiphany was to always start asking, do these really need to be different? Because in my line of work, I'm on a DevSecOps team that helps other teams do, their CI pipelines and stuff if they don't have the right expertise. And a lot of the time, it's like, yeah, of course they do. It's like, well, do they really? Like, is it worth the extra work here to figure out all this customization, versus just having everything be the same? And some of the time they're like, yeah, it's really not.
Yeah.
So that's something I've always started asking now.
Yeah, that's actually a fair point too. I mean, so the specific case that like is driving this whole thing is looking at host latency as picked up by my Istio service meshes across all my clusters, and they are all different, right? And so basically it's this case of, the kind of lead envoy proxy saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing in terms of response latency across all your sidecars. And that really does differ from environment to environment, but actually you do raise a really good point, because how many environments do I really need to be tripping out about? Mainly it's client, test, and prod, whereas all the other ones are like, I could almost not care if like something gets crazy in dev, you know what I mean? So that's a fair point too, actually.
Or is there some threshold, like, where it just doesn't matter? Like,
right.
No human being will ever be able to tell the difference between 0.1 seconds and 0.12 seconds or whatever. Like,
right. Right. Yeah. The only thing that I think, that might not work is because, unfortunately, because like one of my, complaints about Kubernetes is like how it's great, but the layer itself, the Kubernetes layer itself starts to become a snowflake, I think, almost always. And so the problem is that, if there's anything wrong with any cluster, especially like at the host level, then I do have to know about it, even if it's dev. So that's the only thing where I'm like, yeah, I don't know though. I actually may need to be kind of more granular there, but you've given me something to think about, Andy. Thank you as well. So